Korean Mafia boss hired a black female bodyguard. On New Year's crossover night, she took down 60-plus assassins in one night. They laughed when she walked into the penthouse, a fierce, athletic black woman in combat boots standing before the most dangerous criminal board in South Korea. One lieutenant spat on the polished marble near her feet. Another whispered that Park Min-jae, the head of the Obsidian Syndicate, had finally traded his brilliance for desperation. Nia Cross heard every syllable. She understood every sneer. With sharp, unblinking eyes and a jaw set with calm, lethal confidence, she filed every face away for later. When the hiring manager demanded her credentials, Nia didn't slide a paper resume across the table. Instead, she pointed a gloved finger at the crystal glass of champagne sitting in front of Min-jae. "Don't drink that," she said, her voice a low, commanding vibration that cut through the mockery. The room went silent. 5 seconds later, before the head of security could even draw his weapon, Nia moved. She was a blur of black leather and precision, slamming the waiter who had served the drink into the mahogany table. As the man's head cracked against the wood, a small, blue suicide pill fell from his sleeve. "My credentials," Nia whispered into the sudden, suffocating silence, "are that I am currently the only person in this room not trying to end your bloodline." By sunrise, 60 professional killers would lie broken across the obsidian floors, mercenaries, shadowy ninja clans, and elite special operatives, all sent to claim the $50 million New Year's bounty, the largest in Asian underworld history. Every single one of them would be defeated by the woman they had laughed at during her interview. If you believe extraordinary talent comes from the most unexpected places, hit subscribe right now. Only people who judge books by their covers would scroll past this story. Park Min-jae had built his empire on cold, calculating brilliance, rising from the scarred streets of Busan to the glass towers of Gangnam. For 20 years, his name inspired a paralyzing fear, but as the clock ticked toward the new year, the hunter had become the prey. The betrayal didn't come from the outside. It began with whispers among his own kin. A car bomb that missed him by inches, a sniper's round that grazed his collar, and finally, the death of his most trusted advisor, found with a message carved into his chest, "Midnight crossover. You're last." Min-jae sat in his chair, a sharply dressed man with subtle neck tattoos hinting at the violence beneath his polished suit. He looked at Nia Cross and realized that his survival now depended entirely on a woman his own pride told him to reject. Nia wasn't looking for a job. She was a ghost operative, a former elite black ops specialist living in anonymous exile, trying to outrun the nightmares of a country that had discarded her. She took the job not for the money, but because she recognized the look in Min-jae's eyes, the look of a man who realized he was already standing in his own grave. She was about to show him how to climb out. The silence that followed Nia's display in the boardroom was not the respectful quiet of a job well done. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of men realizing they had been breathing in the presence of a predator. Nia didn't move her foot from the neck of the zip-tied waiter, nor did she lower her gaze from Park Min-jae. She watched the way the light from the crystal chandeliers caught the sharp lines of his face, tracing the subtle neck tattoos that peeked above his collar like ink-stained warnings. Min-jae didn't look at the traitor on the floor. He looked at Nia, his cold, calculating stare meeting her unblinking, fierce eyes. In that moment, the foreigner in boots was the only solid thing in a room built on shifting loyalties. Min-jae stood up, the movement slow and deliberate, the silk of his suit whispering against the mahogany chair. He gestured to his remaining inner circle, a collection of lieutenants whose faces were now masks of pale, sweating uncertainty. "Out," he commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a guillotine blade. They didn't argue. They scrambled, their polished shoes clicking frantically against the marble as they fled the presence of a boss who had just seen his own death and the woman who had caught it in her hands. Only Nia and Min-jae remained, separated by a table that had almost become an altar for his execution. Nia finally stepped off the waiter, who was now unconscious and bleeding from a fractured jaw. She kicked the blue suicide pill away from the body, watching it skitter across the floor like a discarded marble. "You knew," Min-jae said, his voice flat. "It wasn't a question." "I didn't know it was him," Nia replied, her tone a low, commanding vibration. "I just knew that in a room full of people who claimed to love you, someone was breathing too fast." Panic has a specific rhythm, Mr. Park. He was offbeat. Min-jae walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the glittering sprawl of Seoul. Below, the city was vibrating with the frantic energy of New Year's Eve. Millions of people were preparing for the crossover, oblivious to the fact that the man who controlled their shipping routes and nightclubs was standing on the edge of a precipice. They call it the Midnight Collective, Min-jae whispered, his breath fogging the glass. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an encrypted tablet, sliding it across the table toward her. Naya picked it up. Her eyes narrowed as she scrolled through the data. It wasn't just a hit list, it was a digital contract, a $50 million bounty hosted on a dark web node that bypassed every international firewall. The timer at the top of the screen was synced to the Seoul Standard Time. It was counting down to midnight, less than 24 hours away. 60, Naya said, reading the fine print of the contract. They aren't sending a team. They're sending a crowd. The bounty is open source, Min-jae explained, finally turning to face her. His polished exterior was still intact, but there was an alertness in his eyes, a realization that his survival was now a mathematical improbability. Anyone with the skill to reach this floor by the time the fireworks start gets a piece of the pie. But the one who delivers my head to the Golden Triangle cartel gets the full 50 million. Naya felt the familiar, cold hum of adrenaline in her marrow. This was the impossible stat she lived for, the 60-1 odds that had defined her career in the shadows of Libya and the Middle East. She looked at the list of confirmed participants already pinging the node. Shadowy ninja clans from Japan, Russian Bratva enforcers, and modern mercenaries from the West. These weren't street thugs, they were elite specialists who saw Min-jae's penthouse as a high-stakes obstacle course. You aren't just paying for a bodyguard, Mr. Park, Naya said, her posture shifting into a stance of pure, lethal control. You're paying for a miracle. They expect a party tonight. They expect a countdown gala where the guest of honor dies at the stroke of 12. My brother, Sang-hoon, orchestrated the gala, Min-jae said, his jaw setting with a bitterness that tasted like iron. He insisted on the public broadcast. He told me it was about projecting power to our rivals. Now I see it was about providing a stage for my murder. Naya walked to the center of the room, her combat boots silent on the marble. She began to see the room differently. The crystal chandeliers weren't decorations, they were potential fragmentation hazards. The velvet curtains were flammable distractions. The floor-to-ceiling glass was a sniper's playground. She was no longer a guest, she was an architect of a tactical death trap. We have 20 hours, Naya said, her sharp, unblinking eyes scanning the perimeter. In that time, this penthouse stops being a home and starts being a kill zone. I need complete control over the elevators, the power grid, and every staff member on the guest list. If they aren't on my approved list, they're a target. Min-jae nodded, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips. He recognized the look in her eyes, the look of a ghost operative who had found a mission that justified her existence. The Obsidian Syndicate is yours to command until the sun rises on January 1st. But tell me, Naya Cross, why do you care? You don't know me. You don't owe me loyalty. Naya paused, her hand resting on the back of a chair. She thought about the nightmares of the country that had discarded her, the years spent in anonymous exile where she felt more like a weapon than a human being. She looked at Min-jae, a man who had built an empire only to find himself alone in a room full of enemies. I don't care about your empire, Mr. Park, she said, her voice dropping to a low, honest rasp. And I don't believe in loyalty. But I do believe in the work. And right now, the work is making sure 60 men find out that underestimating me is the last mistake they'll ever make. She turned back to the tablet, her fingers dancing across the screen as she began to rewrite the security protocols for the Obsidian Syndicate. The $50 million bounty was a siren song, and the predators were already circling the glass tower. They thought they were coming for a payday. They didn't know they were coming for Naya Cross. The Midnight Collective wants a show, Naya whispered to the darkening Seoul skyline. I'm going to give them a massacre. As the first test of the New Year's fireworks crackled in the distance, a small, bright spark against the black velvet of the night, Naya began the lockdown. The countdown hadn't just begun for the year, it had begun for every man who thought the foreigner in boots was a joke. By the time the clock struck 12, The laughter in the Obsidian Syndicate would be replaced by the sound of 60-plus assassins finding out that extraordinary talent truly does come from the most unexpected places. The transition from a penthouse of glass and gold to a tactical slaughterhouse began with the tearing of silk. Naya moved through the Obsidian Syndicate's upper floor not like a guest, but like a demolition expert. Her first act was to purge the room of its vanity. She ripped the heavy, velvet floor-to-ceiling curtains from their tracks, letting the harsh, natural light of a winter soul morning flood the room. These weren't just decorations, they were fire hazards and visual obstructions that would give an assassin a place to hide. Now, the space was raw, exposed, and clear. Min-jae watched from his desk, a glass of water poured by his own hand, sitting untouched. He watched as Naya began to move the furniture. She didn't just push chairs, she created fatal funnels. She positioned the heavy mahogany tables and Italian leather sofas to dictate the flow of movement. Anyone entering the room would be forced into narrow paths, their movements predictable, their bodies funneled into the exact spots where Naya's line of sight would be unobstructed. "You're destroying the most expensive real estate in Gangnam," Min-jae remarked, though his voice held more fascination than protest. "I'm making sure you live to pay the property taxes," Naya replied without looking up. She was currently at the base of the main elevator bank, unscrewing the service panel. Her fingers, calloused from years of handling cordite and cold steel, moved with a surgical grace. She wasn't just disabling the floor stop, she was rewiring the elevator's sensor to her own encrypted tablet. "The elevators are the primary breach point," she explained, her voice dropping into that low, authoritative vibration. "The Midnight Collective will expect my security to be at the doors. They won't expect the elevator itself to be the weapon." She rigged a series of high-intensity strobe lights into the ceiling of the lift, timed to trigger the moment the doors opened on the penthouse level. In the darkness of a power cut, that burst of light would be enough to cause 3 seconds of temporary blindness, all the time she needed to neutralize a squad. By noon, the Fortress of Mirrors was gone. In its place was a skeletal, haunting version of luxury. Naya had stripped the crystal chandeliers of their loose pendants, scattering the sharp glass fragments in the plush carpeting of the secondary entrances. They were silent, invisible landmines that would crunch under a tactical boot, providing an acoustic early warning system that no electronic sensor could match. The emotional weight of the room had shifted. The smell of expensive cologne and aged scotch was replaced by the acrid scent of industrial lubricant and the metallic tang of Naya's gear. She began to assemble her non-lethal arsenal, high-tensile tripwires, pressurized fire extinguishers rigged to blast on a hair trigger, and localized EMP bursts she'd improvised from the building's own high-end sound system. "You've been through this before," Min-jae observed, stepping into the center of the redesigned room. He looked at Naya, really looked at her not as a hire, but as a survivor. "The way you move, it's like you're preparing for a war you've already lost once." Naya paused, a roll of blackened duct tape in her hand. For a second, the fierce, unblinking light in her eyes flickered. She thought of the black site in Libya, the roar of the sand, and the faces of the team she couldn't save because she'd trusted a command that didn't exist. "In my world, Mr. Park, you don't win a war. You just survive the night. I've survived many nights. This one just happens to have a $50 million price tag on it." The first sign of internal sabotage came at 2 p.m. Naya was checking the pressure sensors she'd installed beneath the floorboards of the kitchen entrance when the building's main breaker hummed and died. The penthouse plunged into a gray winter gloom. "The backup generators should have kicked in," Min-jae said, his hand instinctively reaching for the concealed holster at the small of his back. "They didn't because someone cut the fuel lines," Naya stated. She didn't panic. She didn't even draw her weapon. Instead, she pulled her night vision goggles from her tactical pack, the green glow illuminating her set jaw and calm, lethal confidence. "Your brother's men are testing the perimeter. They want to see how I react to a blackout." She moved toward the server room with the silence of a ghost. Inside, she found a young security technician, one of the men who had laughed at her during the interview. He was frantically trying to wipe the surveillance logs, his hands shaking. Naya didn't say a word. She simply appeared behind him, her shadow stretching long across the blinking servers. When the technician turned, his scream was cut short as Naya's palm struck his solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs. She caught him before he hit the floor, her grip like iron. "Who gave you the override codes?" she whispered into his ear. The boy wheezed, his eyes bulging with terror. "Sang-hoon. He said you were just a distraction, that the collective was already inside." Naya's eyes darkened. The betrayal was deeper than she'd calculated. She didn't kill him. She zip-tied his wrists to the server rack and shoved a rag into his mouth. She had no time for a full interrogation. The clock was ticking towards 0, and the kill zone was only half prepared. She returned to the main room, where Min-jae stood in the center of her funnels, a silhouette of power in the dark. "The power is back on in 5 minutes, Naya told him. "I've rerouted the backup through the emergency fire system. But the message is clear. The 60 assassins aren't just coming from the street. They're already breathing the same air as us." She looked at her watch. 19 hours left. The luxury was gone. The masks were slipping. Naya Cross stood in her combat boots amidst the wreckage of a king's palace, her posture saying she had already won. She wasn't just defending a man anymore. She was defending the only thing she had left, her reputation as the last option before a funeral. "Get your vest on, Mr. Park," she said, her voice a low, lethal promise. "The countdown to your brother's mistake has officially begun." The gray soul winter pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting the stripped-down penthouse in a spectral, metallic light. As Naya checked the tension on a high-tensile tripwire stretched across the service entrance, the silence between her and Park Min-jae became a physical weight. Min-jae sat at the edge of the mahogany table, his sharply dressed frame a stark contrast to the tactical chaos surrounding him. He watched her hands that moved with the scarred, rhythmic precision of a master clockmaker, and finally broke the quiet. "They call you a ghost in the syndicate files, Naya." "But even ghosts come from somewhere," Min-jae said, his calculating eyes tracing the faint, jagged line of a scar that disappeared into her sleeve. "A woman with your skill set doesn't just end up bouncing at a Gangnam club because she likes the music. You're overqualified for exile." Naya didn't stop her work. She tightened a lug nut on a pressurized canister, her jaw set with that characteristic lethal confidence. "Exile isn't always a choice, Mr. Park. Sometimes, it's a courtesy the state gives you when they'd rather not go through the trouble of a shallow grave." She stood up, her athletic frame casting a long shadow over the marble floor. She looked out toward the Han River, but her mind was 4,000 miles away, in the humid, concrete heat of Chicago. "I wasn't always a ghost," she began, her voice dropping into a low, gravelly vibration. "Before I was a foreigner in boots, I was Captain Naya Cross of the 75th Ranger Regiment. I was the best they had for the jobs that didn't officially happen." She turned to face him, her sharp eyes unblinking. "Chicago was my home, but the Pentagon was my owner. 10 years ago, they sent my unit into a black site in the Libyan desert. We were told it was a high-value extraction, a diplomat held by rebels. When we breached the compound, we found the diplomat was a CIA bagman shredded by a deal gone wrong, and the rebels were just local families caught in the crossfire." She paused, the memory of the sand and the screaming sirens of the compound echoing in the penthouse silence. "The order came down to sanitize the site. No witnesses. No survivors. I refused. I pulled my team out and saved 14 civilians. By the time we hit the extraction point, the narrative had already been written. My team was ambushed, I was the sole survivor, and I was being charged with the very massacre I'd prevented." Min-jae leaned forward, his cold stare flickering with a rare spark of empathy. "So they erased you." "They tried," Naya said, a bitter, razor-thin smile touching her lips. "They couldn't kill me without a public trial they couldn't afford. So they gave me a dishonorable discharge, stripped my rank, and told me I had 48 hours to vanish before a tragic accident found me. I chose Seoul because it's a city of 12 million people who are too busy looking at their phones to notice a ghost from Chicago. I wanted peace. I wanted to forget that I was a weapon." She walked over to the table, leaning her hands against the wood, her posture saying she had already won her internal war. "But the nightmares don't care about geography, Mr. Park. I took jobs as a bouncer and private security for businessmen who thought my skin made me an exotic accessory rather than a threat. I let them laugh. I let them underestimate me. It kept me under the radar. Until you." Min-jae looked at her, his alert gaze acknowledging the survival instinct that mirrored his own. You recognize the look in my eyes. The look of a man standing in his own grave. I did, Naya admitted, her voice falling into an honest rasp. In Chicago, I learned that loyalty is a lie used by powerful men to get people like me killed. I spent 3 years being cynical, believing that the only thing that mattered was the next check and the next drink. But when I saw you in that boardroom, surrounded by men who were measuring your coffin while you were still breathing, something in me snapped. I realized I didn't want to be a ghost anymore. I wanted to be the wall. The emotional arc between them shifted. It was no longer just a transaction of money for protection. It was two survivors of different wars finding a common language in the silence of a looming siege. Naya's cynicism, the flaw that had kept her isolated and nihilistic since her discharge, was beginning to crack. She wasn't just defending a mafia boss. She was defending the idea that her life and her lethal skills still had a purpose beyond the shadows. The government that discarded me thinks I'm a failure because I wouldn't be their monster, Naya said, her eyes burning with a fierce, renewed urgency. Tonight, I'm going to prove that a ghost is the most dangerous thing they ever created. They sent 60 men to kill you, Min-jae. They sent them because they think you're a problem that can be solved with a bounty. They don't know that the wall standing in their way is a woman who has nothing left to lose and a decade of rage to spend. Min-jae stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where he had built his empire on blood and brilliance. My brother thinks he can buy my legacy for $50 million. He thinks he knows my weaknesses. But he doesn't know you, Naya. He doesn't know Chicago. Naya checked her watch. The countdown to the New Year's crossover was entering its final phase. The 60 assassins of the Midnight Collective were likely already in position, checking their gear in the shadows of the surrounding skyscrapers. She felt the familiar hum of adrenaline, but this time, it was different. It wasn't the cold, empty hum of a mercenary. It was the hot, focused energy of a guardian who had finally found a mission worth coming out of the shadows for. Let them come, Naya whispered, her lethal confidence radiating like a physical heat. The US government couldn't erase me, and 60 mercenaries aren't going to do it either. By the time the sun rises on January 1st, they'll all know the name Naya Cross. And they'll know that the biggest mistake you can make is laughing at a woman in combat boots. She turned back to her traps, her hands moving even faster now, fueled by a purpose that transcended the $50 million bounty. The ghost of Chicago was gone. In her place stood the guardian of the Obsidian Syndicate, and she was ready to turn the midnight sky red. The heavy, pressurized silence of the penthouse was punctured not by a bang, but by the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the service elevator's hydraulic doors. It was 8:14 p.m. The Midnight Collective was early. They had correctly gambled that the primary security focus would be on the grand marble foyer and the high-speed glass lifts reserved for the gala's elite guests. Instead, they had infiltrated through the bowels of the skyscraper, rising through the grease-stained arteries of the building's industrial kitchen service line. Naya didn't need to check the monitors to know they were there. In the center of the stripped-down living area, she felt a subtle vibration through the soles of her combat boots, a disharmony in the building's resting pulse. She signaled to Park Min-jae with a sharp, two-finger gesture. The Mafia boss, sensing the shift in the air, retreated behind the mahogany, fatal funnel she had constructed, his hand disappearing into his suit jacket to grip his sidearm. His obsidian eyes were alert, tracking Naya as she vanished into the deep shadows of the hallway leading to the industrial kitchen. The first 2 assassins emerged from the service entrance with the fluid, silent grace of professionals. They were dressed in matte black tactical gear, their faces obscured by ballistic masks that gave them the appearance of featureless insects. They moved in a synchronized high-low formation, suppressed submachine guns sweeping the stainless steel surfaces of the kitchen. They expected a panicked chef or a stray guard. They didn't expect the darkness itself to strike back. Naya didn't use a gun. A muzzle flash in the cramped, reflective environment of an industrial kitchen was a beacon she didn't want to light yet. Instead, she dropped from the overhead ventilation ducting, her athletic frame hitting the lead assassin with the force of a falling anvil. Before his partner could process the blur of motion, Naya's combat boot connected with the second man's windpipe in a sickening, muffled thud. The lead man, gasping as the air was forced from his lungs, tried to swing his weapon upward. Naya didn't give him the chance. She grabbed the barrel, twisting it with a leverage-driven snap that dislocated his wrist, then drove her palm into the base of his nose. He went down instantly, his body sliding across the polished floor. 2 down. The remaining 8 members of the first 10 breached the door seconds later, prompted by the sudden silence of their scouts. They weren't shadowy ninjas. They were a European mercenary cell, cleaners who specialized in urban wetwork. They fanned out behind the industrial prep stations, their boots crunching on the loose crystal pendants Naya had hidden in the shadows. The sound, a sharp, crystalline crack, was all the radar she needed. Spread out. Flush her out, the team leader hissed in German. Naya smiled in the dark, a cold, predatory expression that would have terrified the men hunting her. She reached for a pull cord she had rigged to the industrial steamer. As the mercenaries moved into the center of the room, she yanked it. A massive, scalding cloud of pressurized steam erupted from the floor vents, whitewashing the room and rendering their night vision goggles useless. In the green-tinted haze of their optics, the world turned into a blinding, featureless static. Naya moved through the steam like a shark through deep water. She didn't need sight. She had memorized every inch of the kill zone. She appeared behind the third mercenary, her arms snaking around his neck in a sleeper hold that cut off the blood flow to his brain in 4 seconds. As he slumped, she snatched a heavy copper sauté pan from a hanging rack and swung it in a low arc. It connected with the kneecap of the fourth man, the sound of shattering bone echoing through the metallic chamber. The kitchen turned into a symphony of controlled, economical violence. The mercenaries began firing blindly into the steam, their suppressed rounds thwip-thwipping into the stainless steel refrigerators and bags of flour. Naya used the noise as cover, closing the distance with the 5th and 6th attackers. She used a kitchen shears as a makeshift dagger, not to kill, but to sever the tendons in their trigger fingers, effectively disarming them before they could reorient. Min-jae, watching from the periphery of the hallway, saw only flashes of Naya's silhouette through the thinning steam, a fierce, athletic blur that seemed to be everywhere at once. He saw her vault over a center island, her body angled protectively away from a spray of gunfire, only to land in a perfect crouch and sweep the legs of the 7th man. By the time the steam cleared, only the team leader remained standing. He was backed against the walk-in freezer, his weapon trembling. He looked around at his elite squad, now a collection of broken bodies and groaning men zip-tied to stove handles and prep tables. He looked at Naya, who stood in the center of the wreckage, her jaw set with that calm, lethal confidence, her chest barely heaving from the exertion. "Who? What are you?" The leader wheezed, his bravado stripped away by the sheer efficiency of his defeat. Naya stepped into the light of a flickering overhead bulb, her unblinking eyes burning with the ghost of Chicago intensity. "I'm the person you should have researched before you accepted the contract," she said, her voice a low, commanding rasp. "And I'm the only reason you're still breathing." She didn't wait for him to respond. A single, precise strike to the temple sent him into the darkness with the rest of his team. Naya walked back to Min-jae, checking the seals on her tactical vest. Her posture said she'd already won this round, but her eyes remained fixed on the countdown clock on her wrist. The first 10 were just the appetizers. The Midnight Collective would learn from this. They would realize that the foreigner in boots wasn't just a bodyguard, she was a tactical nightmare. "Clean up the kitchen, Mr. Park," Naya said, her voice echoing in the now silent penthouse. "The first wave is down. 50 to go. And the next ones won't be coming through the service door." Min-jae looked at the broken mercenaries, then at the woman who had dismantled them in less than 3 minutes. He realized then that the $50 million bounty wasn't just for his head, it was the price of admission to a war he was finally beginning to believe they could win. The metallic tang of the kitchen skirmish still hung in the air, a sharp reminder that the countdown to midnight was no longer a theoretical exercise. Naya didn't linger on the victory. She moved through the penthouse with a predatory grace, her sharp, unblinking eyes scanning for the next hairline fracture in their defense. Park Min-jae followed her, his composure regained, though his hand remained habitually close to the weight of his sidearm. They reached the secondary lounge just as the heavy oak doors swung open, admitting a man who looked like a softer, more frantic reflection of Min-jae. Park Sang-hoon entered the room with a theatrical flourish of panic, his silk tie loosened and his forehead slick with sweat. He was the younger brother, the one meant to handle the legitimate face of the Obsidian Syndicate, but as he looked at the stripped-down, tactical wreckage of the room, his eyes darted with a rhythmic, nervous energy that Naya's internal radar flagged instantly. "Min-jae, thank God you're alive," Sang-hoon gasped, rushing toward his brother. "The perimeter is a mess. I just heard there was a breach in the kitchens. My security teams are saying the sensors were bypassed by a high-level override. We need to leave, now. I have a secondary extraction team waiting in the basement garage." Naya stepped into Sang-hoon's path, her athletic frame forming a solid, immovable barrier. Her posture was angled protectively in front of Min-jae, her jaw set with a calm, lethal confidence that made the younger brother stumble to a halt. "The basement is a kill zone, Sang-hoon," Naya said, her voice a low, commanding vibration. "Anyone going down there right now is walking into a funeral. Yours or his." Sang-hoon sneered, his eyes flicking over Naya's combat boots and tactical vest with a desperate kind of disdain. "You're the help, American. Don't speak to me about security. I've spent the last 6 hours coordinating with the district police and our private contractors to ensure the New Year's broadcast goes off without a hitch. The extraction route is clear." Naya didn't flinch. She leaned in slightly, her unblinking eyes boring into Sang-hoon's. "That's interesting. Because I've been monitoring the building's internal comms for the last 3 hours. There hasn't been a single outgoing signal to the district police. Every line has been dead since the primary breaker accidentally hummed out at noon." Sang-hoon's throat bobbed. I used a satellite encrypted line. You wouldn't have the clearance to see it." "I have every clearance that matters tonight," Naya countered. She reached into her tactical pouch and pulled out the small, black transceiver she had recovered from the technician in the server room. "I found this in the hands of a boy who said you gave him the override codes. He said you told him I was just a distraction. A pretty little ghost for the assassins to hunt while you moved the real target." Min-jae's face turned into a mask of obsidian ice. He stepped out from behind Naya, his cold, calculating stare fixed on his brother. "Sang-hoon, is there something you want to tell me about the New Year's broadcast?" The younger brother's facade began to crack like cheap porcelain. He backed away, his hands raised in a gesture of false innocence. "Min-jae, you're listening to a foreigner? Someone who was kicked out of her own army? I'm your blood. I'm the one who kept the syndicate profitable while you were playing soldier with the Yakuza. I'm trying to save us." "You're trying to save yourself," Naya interrupted, her voice dropping into an honest, lethal rasp. "I noticed your tactical twitch the moment you walked in. Your left hand has been hovering over your pocket since you mentioned the garage. You aren't reaching for a key, are you?" Before Sang-hoon could react, Naya's hand shot out with the speed of a striking viper. She grabbed his wrist, twisting it upward in a joint lock that forced a yelp of pain from his lungs. With her other hand, she reached into his coat and pulled out a sleek, government-issue burner phone. The screen was still active. It showed a map of the penthouse with 60 red dots converging on the rooftop helipad. "The Midnight Collective isn't just a bounty," Naya whispered, her face inches from Sang-hoon's. "It's a guided tour. And you're the guide." Min-jae took the phone from Naya's hand, his eyes scanning the data. The betrayal was absolute. His own brother had not only sold the floor plans, but had also coordinated the New Year's strike to ensure that the broadcast would capture his execution in 4K resolution, clearing the path for Sang-hoon to inherit the Obsidian throne under the guise of a grieving successor. "Why?" Min-jae asked, the words sounding like a death sentence. "Because you're a dinosaur." Sang-hoon screamed, the panic finally boiling over into a raw, envious rage. "You talk about tradition and honor while the world moves on to data and influence. The Golden Triangle offered me a seat at the table you were too proud to sit at. They don't want a dragon, Min-jae. They want a partner. One who knows how to follow orders." Naya felt a surge of the old Chicago heat in her veins, the rage she felt when she saw men in power sacrifice their own for a better seat at a table that didn't exist. She looked at Min-jae, expecting him to pull his weapon. Instead, the Mafia boss looked at Naya, a silent question in his eyes. He was no longer just the employer. He was a man realizing that his blood was poison and the outsider was the only cure. He stays here, Min-jae said, his voice devoid of emotion. Zip tie him to the mahogany table he loves so much. If the 60 assassins make it past you, Naya, he can be the first thing they see when they walk through the door. Naya didn't hesitate. She threw Sang-hoon toward the center of the fatal funnel she had created. With a series of clicks that sounded like a clock's final seconds, she secured his wrists to the heavy furniture. The younger brother began to sob, the bravado of the traitor replaced by the cowardice of the caught. Naya stood up, checking her tactical gear one last time. She looked at the countdown clock on the wall. 11 p.m. The hour of the Midnight Collective had arrived. The internal threat was neutralized, but the external storm was about to break. You were right about one thing, Sang-hoon, Naya said, her unblinking eyes fixed on the elevator doors. The New Year's broadcast is going to be unforgettable. But nobody's going to be watching you. They're going to be watching the woman you laughed at show 60 professionals why she's the only person in this city who actually knows what she's doing. She turned to Min-jae, her posture saying she'd already won the psychological war. The brother's shadow is gone, Mr. Park. Now there's only the light of the fireworks and the bodies I'm about to leave on your floor. Stay behind the funnels. The real show is about to start. Min-jae nodded, his calculating stare now filled with a profound, grim respect. He watched as Naya Cross vanished into the shadows of the darkened lounge, a fierce, athletic guardian ready to turn a night of betrayal into a legend of survival. The digital numbers on the penthouse's remaining backup monitors flickered with a cold, predatory rhythm. 11:30 p.m. For most of Seoul, this was the moment of peak anticipation, the half-hour mark where the city held its breath before the final plunge into a new year. But inside the Obsidian Tower, the anticipation was a different kind of animal. The air felt charged, ionized by the static of approaching violence. Naya Cross stood in the center of the dark lounge, her breathing slow and deliberate, a sharp contrast to the frantic sobbing of Sang-hoon, who remained zip-tied to the mahogany table like a sacrifice to a god he no longer understood. Then, the world died. It wasn't a flicker or a brownout, it was a total, absolute erasure of light. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the glittering tapestry of Gangnam vanished as the district's power grid was severed by a surgical cyber attack. The glowing Han River bridges, the neon signs of the luxury boutiques, and the streetlights below all winked out simultaneously, plunging the world into a prehistoric gloom. The only things left were the stars and the faint, green luminescence of Naya's night vision goggles as she flipped them down, her jaw setting with a calm, lethal confidence. "It's time," Naya whispered. The sound of her voice, a low and commanding vibration, seemed to steady Park Min-jae, who stood in the shadows of the fatal funnel with his weapon drawn. The primary force of the Midnight Collective didn't waste time with stealth. They knew the internal security was compromised, and they knew their guide was no longer responding. 40 mercenaries, the heavy hitters of the contract, arrived not through the doors, but through the glass. The air exploded inward as 4 coordinated thermal breaches shattered the reinforced windows on the east and west wings. The freezing winter wind roared into the penthouse, carrying with it the smell of cordite and the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of heavy-duty, rappelling ropes hitting the floorboards. These were not the desperate cleaners from the kitchen. These were Tier 1 operators, men who had fought in the gray zones of Eastern Europe and the jungles of Southeast Asia. They moved in 4 squads of 10, their movements a synchronized dance of destruction. As they unclipped from their harnesses, they fanned out, their suppressed rifles spitting tongues of blue flame into the darkness. Contact. East Wing. 2 targets identified, a voice barked over a tactical radio frequency Naya had intercepted. Naya didn't stay to trade fire. She was a ghost of Chicago, and a ghost doesn't fight on the enemy's terms. She triggered the first of her traps, a series of high-decibel sonic emitters hidden in the ventilation ducts. A piercing, soul-shredding shriek tore through the room, a frequency designed to shatter the equilibrium of anyone wearing electronic ear protection. The mercenaries stumbled, their hands flying to their headsets as their inner ears rebelled against the sound. Now, Naya hissed to herself. She emerged from a hidden panel in the ceiling directly above the East Squad. She didn't use a rifle, she used the environment. She swung down on a rappelling line she had repurposed, her combat boots connecting with the chest of an operator with the force of a battering ram. As she hit the floor, she spun, sweeping the legs of the second man and driving a tactical baton into the base of his skull. Before the remaining 8 could recalibrate their sensors, Naya rolled behind a reinforced marble pillar, her athletic frame a blur of black leather and focused rage. "She's in the walls. Watch the shadows," a mercenary screamed, his voice cracking with the first notes of genuine terror. The mercenaries tried to regroup, but Naya had spent 24 hours turning this luxury space into a labyrinth of pain. A squad of 10 tried to push through the main lounge, their boots crunching on the hidden glass pendants Naya had scattered earlier. The sound alerted her to their exact coordinates. She reached into her vest and tossed 2 blackout grenades, not flashbangs, but canisters that emitted a thick, conductive particulate cloud that shorted out their night vision optics and thermal sensors. In the green-tinted world of her own goggles, Naya saw them as stumbling, sightless ghosts. She moved among them with a fierce, unblinking intensity. She was a phantom of economical violence. A strike to a temple here, a knee to a kidney there. She moved with a rhythmic, lethal confidence, her body angled to use their own comrades as shields whenever a stray shot was fired. One by one, the red blips on her internal map began to fade into the gray of unconsciousness. Min-jae watched from his position, his obsidian eyes wide with a profound, grim respect. He saw the way Naya operated, not as a soldier following orders, but as a guardian protecting a life she had decided was worth saving. She wasn't just neutralizing threats, she was dismantling an army. The main force realized they were being picked apart. The remaining 20 operators pulled back, forming a defensive circle around the elevator bank, their rifles aimed outward. They were waiting for their leader, a man who hadn't yet entered the fray. "Naya Cross," a voice boomed from the darkness of the hallway, a voice she recognized from a different life. "I knew the agency couldn't kill a brawler like you. But you're on the wrong side of the ledger tonight, Captain." Naya froze, her hand tightening on her baton. The voice belonged to Commander Silas Thorne, the man who had signed her dishonorable discharge papers in Chicago. The man who had sold her unit out in Libya. He was the leader of the 60, the insurance policy the Golden Triangle had sent to ensure the $50 million was spent. "Thorne," Naya whispered, her voice an honest, lethal rasp. "I should have known you'd be the one to crawl out of the gutter for a payday." "It's not just a payday, Naya. It's a cleanup," Thorne replied, his footsteps heavy and arrogant on the marble. "You're the last loose end from the desert. And Min-jae is just the bonus. Step aside, and maybe I'll let you choose the color of your coffin this time." Naya looked at Min-jae, then at the crying Sang-hoon, and finally at the countdown clock. 11:45 p.m. The fireworks were only 15 minutes away. Her cynicism, the flaw that had kept her running for 3 years, was completely gone, replaced by a mission-focused resolve that burned hotter than any thermite. "You're not leaving this floor," Thorne, Naya said, her posture saying she had already won the psychological war. "And neither are your men. Chicago remembers what you did. And tonight, Seoul is going to help me settle the debt." She signaled to Min-jae to stay low and triggered the elevator breach protocol. The countdown to the final crossover hadn't just reached its peak, it had reached the point of no return. Naya Cross stood in the heart of the darkness, her unblinking eyes fixed on the man who had ruined her life, ready to show 40 mercenaries why you never laugh at a woman who has nothing left to lose but her honor. The ticking of the countdown clock in the penthouse had become a heartbeat, a rhythmic pressure that synced with the blood pounding in Naya's ears. It was 11:45 p.m. The air was thick with the smell of ionized dust, spent shells, and the freezing winter wind howling through the shattered glass. Silas Thorne's laughter echoed from the darkness of the hallway, a sound that carried the rot of a decade of betrayals. He wasn't just a commander anymore, he was a ghost that Naya had finally cornered. "You always were too sentimental for this line of work, Naya." Thorne's voice boomed, accompanied by the heavy clack-clack of his men reloading. "This isn't Chicago. There's no court-martial here. Just gravity and silence." Naya didn't answer with words. She answered with the elevator breach protocol. With a sharp tap on her wrist-mounted tablet, the penthouse lights didn't just come on, they detonated. A sequence of high-intensity, 10,000 lumen tactical strobes she had hidden in the crown molding began to fire in a jagged, staccato rhythm. To the mercenaries, the world became a fractured, blinding nightmare where distance and depth were impossible to calculate. To Naya, who had adjusted her optics to filter the frequency, the room remained a clear, green-tinted map of targets. She moved. The next 15 minutes were a masterclass in non-lethal lethality. Naya didn't want the Midnight Collective dead. She wanted them broken, captured, and capable of testifying against the men who had sent them. She became a blur of black leather and focused rage, clearing the long, marble-lined hallway of the East Wing. The first 3 mercenaries didn't even see her coming. She used the strobes to mask her approach, sliding across the floorboards and sweeping their legs with a collapsible steel baton. As they fell, she delivered precise, measured strikes to the brachial plexus, nerve clusters that sent their limbs into immediate, temporary paralysis. "She's in the flicker." "Fire at the gaps," one operator screamed. A spray of suppressed fire chewed into the mahogany walls, but Naya was already gone. She vaulted over a decorative stone planter, using her momentum to drive both knees into the chest of a 4th attacker. Before he hit the ground, she had already snapped a heavy-duty zip tie around his wrists and rolled into the shadows of a recessed alcove. Naya was a phantom of economical violence. Every movement had a purpose. She used a heavy velvet sash, stripped from the windows earlier, as a garrote to drag a 5th man into the dark, leaving him unconscious and bound. She didn't waste energy on prolonged grapples. She fought like a machine programmed to solve a 60-part equation, one broken bone at a time. Min-jae watched from the fatal funnel, his sidearm held in a steady grip, his obsidian eyes tracking the carnage. He saw Naya engage 3 mercenaries simultaneously near the elevator bank. She was a fierce, athletic whirlwind. She blocked a knife strike with her forearm guard, redirected the attacker's arm into his comrade's throat, and delivered a spinning back kick that sent the 3rd man flying into the elevator doors with a bone-shattering clang. "Thorn, your men are falling like dry leaves." Naya's voice rang out, a low, commanding vibration that cut through the strobe-lit chaos. "Is this the best the Golden Triangle's 50 million can buy?" In the central lounge, the battle reached its fever pitch. The remaining 15 mercenaries of the main force realized their tactical gear was being used against them. They discarded their blinded night vision goggles, trying to fight with their bare eyes in the flickering strobes. It was a fatal mistake. Naya triggered the localized EMP burst she had rigged into the penthouse's high-end sound system. A wall of magnetic force surged through the room, frying the electronics in their tactical headsets and shorting out the lasers on their rifles. For the mercenaries, the world went silent and dark. For Naya, it was the moment of the harvest. She cleared the lounge in a rhythmic, lethal dance. Strike. Zip tie. Move. Strike. Zip tie. Move. She used a fire extinguisher as a bludgeon, the heavy metal canister cracking helmets and ribs with terrifying efficiency. She was the ghost of Chicago no longer. She was a force of nature that had found its mission. She wasn't just defending a mafia boss. She was reclaiming her own soul from the men who had tried to erase it. By the time the clock hit 11:55 p.m., the hallway was a graveyard of living ghosts. 46 mercenaries lay bound and broken across the marble, their groans the only music for the approaching new year. Naya stood at the end of the long corridor, her chest heaving, her combat boots stained with the dust of the struggle. Her jaw was set with a calm, lethal confidence that had only grown with every neutralized threat. Only Thorn remained. He stood by the shattered windows of the West Wing, his silhouette framed by the first few premature flares of the city's firework display. He held a heavy-caliber handgun, but his hands, for the first time in his career, were shaking. He looked at the floor, at the 40 elite operators Naya had dismantled without firing a single lethal shot. "You're a freak, Naya," Thorn spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and hatred. "They should have burned you in Libya when they had the chance." "They tried," Naya said, her unblinking eyes fixed on him. "But I learned something in the desert, Silas. Monsters don't die in the fire. They just get tempered." She began to walk toward him, her posture saying she had already won. She didn't draw a gun. She didn't need one. She was the weapon. Behind her, Park Min-jae stepped out of the shadows, his presence a silent testament to the survival Naya had guaranteed. The $50 million bounty was still active, and there were still 14 assassins unaccounted for, the elite leader of the 60 and his personal guard, but the hallway of 60 shadows had been cleared. 5 minutes to midnight, Thorn, Naya whispered, her voice a low, commanding rasp. The whole city is watching the countdown. Do you want to spend the first minute of the new year on your knees, or over the edge of this building? The fireworks began to bloom over the Han River in earnest now, splashes of red and gold that reflected in the blood on the marble floor. The final crossover was here. Naya Cross, the woman they had laughed at, stood as the lone guardian of the Obsidian Tower, ready to finish the debt that had started in Chicago and would end in the sky over Seoul. The sky over Seoul ignited. It wasn't the searing heat of a thermite charge or the blinding flash of a tactical strobe, but a riot of celebratory red, emerald, and gold. 11:58 p.m. Below the Obsidian Tower, millions of voices were beginning the final count, their joy a distant, muffled roar that contrasted sharply with the thin, freezing air of the rooftop. Naya Cross stepped out onto the helipad, her combat boots crunching on a fine layer of frost. Her chest heaved with the exertion of the last hour, but her unblinking eyes were fixed forward, locked on the silhouette of Silas Thorn. Thorn stood at the very edge of the roof, the wind whipping his heavy tactical coat around his legs like a shroud. Beside him were the final remains of the Midnight Collective, 3 elite Spectre operatives, the insurance policy Naya had anticipated. These were the ghosts of her own training, men who moved with the same economical precision she did. They didn't scramble for cover. They stood in a diamond formation, their suppressed sidearms leveled at the door. Park Min-jae stepped out behind Naya, his face a cold mask of obsidian. He didn't look like a victim anymore. He looked like a king reclaiming a ruined palace. He watched Naya's back, seeing the way her athletic frame coiled like a spring, her lethal confidence radiating a heat that the winter wind couldn't touch. Beautiful, isn't it? Thorn shouted over the concussive boom of a massive floral firework that blossomed in violet light behind him. A $50 million view. It's a shame you won't live to see the clock hit 0, Naya. You could have been a legend in the agency. Instead, you're going to be a stain on a Seoul sidewalk. Naya didn't waste breath on a retort. She signaled Min-jae to stay back and moved. The 3 elite guards fired simultaneously. Naya didn't duck, she flowed. She used the heavy steel base of the rooftop's weather station as a temporary shield, the suppressed rounds pinging off the metal like angry hornets. In the split second they took to recalibrate, she launched 2 localized EMP discs across the frost-slicked concrete. They skittered toward the guards' feet and detonated in a soft blue hum. The electronics in their smart aiming optics flickered and died, forcing them to rely on iron sights and instinct. Naya didn't give them instinct. She closed the distance in a blur of black leather. She engaged the first guard with a brutal 3-point strike, palm to the chin, elbow to the solar plexus, knee to the thigh. He folded like a broken chair. The second guard swung a tactical knife in a low, disemboweling arc, but Naya parried with her forearm guards, the metal screeching as it sparked. She twisted his wrist until the bone sang, stripped the blade, and drove the hilt into his temple. The third guard was faster, catching Naya with a heavy kick to the ribs that sent her reeling toward the edge of the roof. For a heartbeat, she was suspended over the abyss, the neon lights of the city spinning below her. But Naya didn't panic. She had survived Chicago. She had survived Libya. She used her momentum to grab the guard's ankle, pulling him down with her. As they hit the concrete, she rolled, pinned him, and delivered a measured strike to his carotid artery. 63. The count was complete. Naya stood up, her side aching from the rib strike, her jaw set harder than the steel around her. She turned to Thorn. The commander had discarded his gun, realizing that in this wind and at this range, it was a liability. He drew a heavy, serrated combat knife, the same model they had been issued in the Rangers. Just like the old days, Captain, Thorn sneered, his face illuminated by a massive burst of gold fireworks. 1-on-1. No backup. No agency. Just the better soldier. The clock struck 11:59 p.m. The city below erupted in a unified shout that bypassed the wind. 10. 9. Thorn lunged. He was bigger, stronger, and driven by a decade of unchecked arrogance. His strikes were heavy, intended to crush rather than cut. Naya moved like smoke. She wasn't fighting for a paycheck. She was fighting for the 14 lives in Libya, for the 3 years of exile, and for the man standing behind her who had seen a warrior where the world saw a waitress. 8. 7. Naya parried a high strike, the serrated blade whistling inches from her throat. She countered with a lightning-fast jab to Thorne's throat, but he caught her wrist, his grip like a vice. They grappled in the center of the helipad, two ghosts of a forgotten war silhouetted against the exploding sky. 6. 5. You're weak, Naya. Thorne hissed into her ear, his breath smelling of tobacco and failure. You think saving one mob boss changes anything? You're still a ghost. You're still nothing. I'm the wall, Silas, Naya rasped, her unblinking eyes burning into his. And you just hit it. 4. 3. Naya used a low-center hip throw, a move Thorne had taught her years ago, and flipped his massive weight over her shoulder. As he hit the frost-covered concrete, she didn't go for his throat. She went for his hands. With a series of sickening cracks, she disarmed him and pinned his arms with her knees. 2. 1. Happy New Year. The sky turned into a literal sun of white and gold. The roar of the city was deafening. In the sudden, brilliant light of the first second of January, Naya looked down at Thorne. She had the serrated knife at his throat, her athletic frame poised for the final cut. She could feel the ghost of Chicago screaming for blood, for justice, for the end of the nightmare. She looked at Min-jae. The Mafia boss stood silent, watching her. He didn't nod. He didn't demand the kill. He was waiting to see who she really was. Naya took a deep breath of the freezing midnight air. She didn't cut. Instead, she slammed the hilt of the knife into Thorne's forehead, knocking him into a deep, permanent unconsciousness. She stood up, the knife falling from her hand to clatter harmlessly on the roof. 60 plus, Mr. Park, Naya said, her voice a low, commanding vibration that carried over the fading roar of the fireworks. All alive. All yours. Min-jae walked to her side, looking down at the broken commander of the Midnight Collective. He looked at the city, then back at Naya. The cynicism that had defined both of them 24 hours ago was gone, replaced by something much rarer in their world, a mutual, unbreakable respect. The contract is over, Naya Cross, Min-jae said, his calculating stare softening into a look of profound gratitude. But the legend is just beginning. Naya looked at her hands. They weren't shaking. For the first time in a decade, the nightmares were quiet. She had defended the life of a man, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her own. The new year had begun, and the waitress was gone. In her place stood the guardian of soul, and she was finally ready to face the dawn. The celebration of a city reborn in the new year echoed against the glass of the obsidian tower, but inside, the air was cold enough to kill. Naya Cross led Park Min-jae back down from the rooftop, her combat boots leaving red-tinted prints on the pristine marble of the penthouse lounge. The transition from the chaotic, firework-lit sky to the sterile, ruined interior was jarring. Naya's eyes, sharp and unblinking, immediately locked on the center of the room. Park Sang-hoon was still there, zip-tied to the mahogany table, but his sobbing had stopped. He sat in a pool of shadow, his silk suit rumpled, looking like a discarded toy in a room full of broken giants. Naya stepped aside, allowing Min-jae to approach his brother. She didn't lower her guard. She remained angled protectively, her jaw set with that calm, lethal confidence that had carried them through the last 60 enemies. She watched the way Min-jae walked, slow, deliberate, each step sounding like the ticking of a clock that had finally run out of time. He stopped 3 feet from Sang-hoon, his obsidian eyes devoid of the calculation that usually defined them. There was only a hollow, echoing silence. The Midnight Collective is gone, Sang-hoon, Min-jae said, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm vibration. Thorne is in chains on the roof. Your 60 assassins are broken. And I am still breathing. Sang-hoon looked up, his face a mess of sweat and salt. The envy that had fueled his betrayal was gone, replaced by the raw, animalistic terror of a man looking at his own executioner. Min-jae, brother, they pressured me. The Golden Triangle, they said you were a relic. They said the business needed a modern touch. I was trying to protect the family's future. You sold my head for a seat at a table that isn't even in this country, Min-jae replied. He reached out and pulled the burner phone from his pocket, the one Naya had recovered. He dropped it onto the mahogany table. It clattered against the wood, a small, glowing piece of evidence that had cost 60 lives. You didn't protect the family. You butchered it. Min-jae turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting Naya's. The silent question from the rooftop returned, but this time it was heavier, laced with the ancient weight of Mafia tradition. In the Obsidian Syndicate, blood for blood was the only currency that maintained the order. To let a traitor live, even a brother, was a sign of a weakness that could bring the whole empire down. Naya, Min-jae said, his voice steady. He is my blood. According to the laws of my world, I cannot let him walk out of this room. But according to the laws of the world you've given me back tonight, what do you see? Naya felt the heavy weight of the serrated knife she had reclaimed from the roof. She looked at Sang-hoon, then at the man she had spent the last 24 hours defending. She thought about Chicago. She thought about the sanitization order she had refused, the moment she decided that being a soldier didn't mean being a murderer. Her cynical shell had been shattered by the night's events, leaving behind the core of the woman who had saved 14 civilians in Libya. I see a coward, Mr. Park, Naya said, her voice an honest, commanding rasp. But I also see the cycle. You kill him, and you become exactly what the Golden Triangle wants you to be, a man who rules by fear and blood. You spent the night fighting to keep your life. Don't spend the first hour of the new year losing your soul. Min-jae's hand twitched toward the sidearm in his holster. The tension in the room was a physical cord, stretched to the point of snapping. Sang-hoon began to wail, a high-pitched, pathetic sound that filled the lounge. My world doesn't allow for mercy, Naya, Min-jae whispered. Then change your world, Naya countered, stepping closer, her athletic frame casting a shadow over the brothers. You hired me to be the wall. I've spent the night holding back 60 men. Let me hold back this one last mistake. If you pull that trigger, the Midnight Collective wins. They prove that the Obsidian Syndicate is nothing more than a cage for monsters. Min-jae looked at his brother, the boy he had protected in the slums of Busan, the man he had groomed to be his successor. He saw the rot, but he also saw the shared history that no amount of betrayal could fully erase. He looked at Naya Cross, the black woman in combat boots who had stood as his lone guardian when everyone else had fled or turned. She was the only person in his life who had ever given him a choice that didn't involve a body count. With a sudden, violent motion, Min-jae drew his weapon. Sang-hoon screamed, closing his eyes and shrinking into the mahogany. Naya's hand went to her own holster, her instinct screaming to intervene, but she hesitated. She saw Min-jae's finger. It wasn't on the trigger. Min-jae didn't aim at his brother's head. He aimed at the zip ties. 2 sharp cracks echoed through the room. The plastic binding snapped, and Sang-hoon fell forward, his face hitting the mahogany table he had coveted so much. Get out, Min-jae commanded, the words sounding like they were being dragged over broken glass. You are no longer my brother. You are no longer Park. You are a ghost. If I see your face in this city again, if I hear your name whispered in the syndicate, Naya won't be there to stop me. Go to the Golden Triangle. Tell them the dragon is still awake. And tell them I'm coming for the seat at the head of the table. Sang-hoon didn't wait for a second chance. He scrambled to his feet, his silk suit ruined, and fled toward the service elevator, not once looking back at the brother whose life he had tried to sell. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of the siege or the silence of the kill zone. It was the silence of a clean slate. Min-jae holstered his weapon and turned to Naya, his cold, calculating stare now filled with a profound, weary clarity. You're a dangerous woman, Naya Cross, he said, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. You didn't just save my life. You made me responsible for it. Naya relaxed her posture, the lethal confidence softening into a quiet, victorious calm. She looked at her watch. 12:30 a.m. The first day of the new year was 30 minutes old. That's the problem with surviving, Mr. Park. You have to figure out what to do with the time you have left. She walked to the shattered window, looking out at the Han River where the smoke from the fireworks was still drifting like a beautiful, gray shroud. The blood lineage had been severed, not by a bullet, but by a decision. She had pulled the psychological trigger, and in doing so, She had finally outrun the ghost of Chicago. The contract is officially closed, Naya said, turning back to him. But I think your legitimate business is going to need a very specific kind of security from now on. Someone who knows how to handle 60-plus problems in a single night. Min-jae nodded, the dragon and the guardian standing together in the wreckage of the old world, ready to build a new one. I wouldn't have it any other way, Captain. The first hour of the new year was cold, quiet, and tasted of ozone. The fires from the thermal breaches had been suppressed by the building's emergency systems, leaving a fine mist of water and white powder to settle over the wreckage of the Obsidian Syndicate's crown jewel. Naya Cross did not stop to celebrate. While the rest of Seoul was lost in a drunken haze of resolution and relief, she moved through the penthouse with the focused intensity of a surgeon cleaning a wound. The threat of the 60 assassins had been neutralized, but the shadow that had sent them was still out there, hiding in the encrypted layers of the global underworld. Naya knelt by the unconscious form of Commander Silas Thorne on the rooftop. She didn't look at his face. She looked at the tactical hub strapped to his forearm. With the methodical precision of the ghost of Chicago, she bypassed the biometric locks using a localized bypass kit from her vest. The screen flickered to life, illuminating her sharp, athletic features in a ghostly blue hue. This was the Ledger of Shadows, the digital paper trail of the Midnight Collective. You're looking for more than just a paycheck, aren't you? Park Min-jae's voice drifted through the freezing air. He stood at the edge of the helipad, his sharply dressed silhouette framed by the rising smoke of the city below. He looked at the device in Naya's hands with a mixture of caution and curiosity. I'm looking for the insurance policy, Mr. Park, Naya replied, her voice a low, commanding vibration. A $50 million bounty doesn't just vanish because the hitters failed. It stays active until the node is destroyed. If I don't secure this ledger, there will be another 60 men on your floor by noon tomorrow. And next time, they won't come through the windows. She began to upload the data to her own encrypted drive, watching the progress bars crawl across the screen. The ledger was a treasure trove of corruption. It contained the identities of the silent partners who had backed Sang-hoon's betrayal, names that reached far beyond the Golden Triangle. There were high-ranking officials in the NIS, international bankers, and, most chillingly, the ghost signatures of the very agency operatives who had erased Naya's career in Chicago. It's all here, Naya whispered, her jaw setting with a calm, lethal confidence. The names, the bank accounts, the strike orders. This isn't just a hit list, it's a map of the rot that's been feeding on your syndicate. Min-jae walked closer, his obsidian eyes scanning the flowing lines of code. For 20 years, he had ruled through blood and brilliance, believing he was the highest power in his world. Looking at the ledger, he realized he was just a piece on a much larger, much darker board. What do you intend to do with it? That data could burn half of Seoul to the ground. Naya stood up, the transfer complete. She snapped Thorne's hub in half with a single, practiced motion and tossed the pieces into the abyss of the city streets. I'm not a whistleblower, Mr. Park. I'm a guardian. I'm going to use this to build a perimeter around you that no one can cross. And then, I'm going to use the rest to make sure the people who tried to bury me realize they missed. They retreated from the rooftop, returning to the penthouse where the cleanup had already begun. A team of Min-jae's most loyal cleaners, those who had survived because Naya had identified them as non-threats earlier, were moving the broken mercenaries like sacks of grain. The atmosphere was one of grim efficiency. Naya led Min-jae to the primary server room, the heart of the Syndicate's data empire. I'm rerouting the Syndicate's assets through a series of shell nodes I used in the Rangers, Naya explained, her fingers dancing across the terminal. By sunrise, the Obsidian Syndicate will be a ghost on the dark web. The bounty will ping a dead address. To the world, the strike on the crossover was a success, and the assets have been seized. It'll buy you the time you need to purge the rest of the board. Min-jae watched her, his calculating stare filled with a profound, quiet awe. He had hired a bodyguard. He had received an architect of a new reality. He saw the way Naya operated, not with the messy, loud violence of the Mafia, but with the invisible, surgical precision of a shadow operative who had finally found a cause worth her genius. You're not just securing my data, Naya, Min-jae observed, his voice a low rasp of realization. You're securing your own freedom. Naya paused, her unblinking eyes reflecting the green light of the servers. In Chicago, they told me that knowledge was a burden. They used it to keep me in line. But tonight, I realized that the only person who can keep me in line is me. The Ledger of Shadows is my shield. As long as I have it, the agency won't come for me. And as long as I'm here, they won't come for you. She hit the final key, and the servers hummed with a renewed, deep cycle frequency. The Obsidian Syndicate's data was now locked behind a wall of ghost encryption that would take a decade to crack. The immediate threat of the Midnight Collective was extinguished. The $50 million bounty was a flickering memory on a dead screen. Naya turned to Min-jae, her athletic frame relaxed for the first time in 24 hours. The lethal confidence was still there, but it was no longer a mask. It was a settled truth. She looked around the ruined server room, then at the man who had risked his life to trust an outsider. The ledger is secure, Naya stated. Your brother is gone. Thorn is in a deep-cover NIS holding cell, and the world thinks you're a memory. You have 24 hours of total anonymity. Use them wisely, Mr. Park. Min-jae stepped forward, extending a hand. It wasn't the handshake of a boss to an employee, it was the pact of two survivors who had found their purpose in the heart of a massacre. I told you earlier that you've made me responsible for my life. Now, I'm asking you to help me lead it. The dragon needs a guardian who isn't afraid to pull the truth out of the shadows. Naya looked at his hand, then at the dawn beginning to break over the Han River, a sliver of gray and gold that promised the first morning of a new world. Her cynicism was a ghost of the past. She wasn't a waitress, and she wasn't a disgraced captain. She was the woman who had taken down 60-plus assassins in a single night, and she was just getting started. I'm not going anywhere, Min-jae, she said, her voice a low, commanding vibration. We have a lot of work to do before the world finds out we're still here. She took his hand, their grip firm and unbreakable as the first light of January 1st flooded the room, turning the Ledger of Shadows into a blueprint for a future they would write together. The first sunrise of the year did not rise over a city in ruins, but over a soul that seemed polished, silent, and strangely reborn. The sky was a bruised palette of violet and pale gold, the light reflecting off the Han River with a clarity that felt almost holy. Inside the obsidian tower, the air had finally settled. The smell of cordite had been replaced by the crisp, biting scent of the winter morning drifting through the temporary barricades. Naya Cross stood by the jagged remains of the West Wing window, her athletic frame silhouetted against the dawn. Her combat boots were scuffed, her tactical vest was heavy with the dust of 60 defeated men, but her unblinking eyes were clear. The ghost of Chicago was gone, burned away by the fires of the New Year's crossover. Park Min-jae stood several paces behind her. He had changed into a fresh suit, charcoal gray, impeccable, devoid of the bloodstains of the previous night. He looked every bit the powerful chairman, but the cold, calculating stare had been replaced by a quiet, contemplative peace. He wasn't looking at his empire. He was looking at the woman who had redefined it. In his hand, he held a single, physical file, the legitimate restructuring plans for the Obsidian Syndicate. It was the first step toward a life that didn't require taste testers for his tea or snipers on his roof. The police arrived 10 minutes ago, Min-jae said, his voice a low, steady vibration in the quiet room. They found Thorn and the others exactly where you left them. Bound, catalogued, and accompanied by the evidence of their own crimes. The NIS is already calling it the largest counterterrorism victory in Korean history. They don't know who did it. They're calling you the Midnight Phantom. Naya turned slightly, a faint, razor-thin smile touching her lips. Phantoms are easier to deal with than people, Mr. Park. People have names. People have paper trails. A phantom just is. Min-jae walked to the window, standing beside her as the sun began to climb higher, illuminating the sprawling district of Gangnam. The board of directors is meeting at noon. They expect me to demand blood for Sang-hoon's betrayal. Instead, I'm going to announce the dissolution of the syndicate's illegal holdings. We're moving into green energy and global logistics. Legitimate, transparent, and untouchable. It's what you suggested. To change the world, I have to change my own. He paused, looking at her with a profound, grim respect. But I cannot do this alone, Naya. A man who moves from the shadows into the light is the most visible target of all. I need the wall. I need you. Naya looked at the city she had saved, the city that had once been her place of anonymous exile. She thought about the Legion of Shadows data she had secured, the names of the men who still thought she was a disgraced failure. She realized that her work here was done. To stay at Min-jae's side as a public figure would be to invite the very agency she had just outmaneuvered. To protect him, she had to return to the place where she was most effective, the periphery. You aren't alone, Min-jae, Naya said, her voice dropping into an honest, commanding rasp. You have the ledger. You have the truth. And you have the fear of every man who watched 60 professionals fall in a single night. That fear is your best bodyguard now. She reached out and adjusted the lapel of his suit, a gesture of familiarity and finality. Her jaw was set with that calm, lethal confidence that had become her signature. If I stay, I become a target that people can aim at. If I vanish, I become a legend that keeps them awake at night. You don't need a shadow following you into the light. You need the world to know that if they ever cross the line again, the Midnight Phantom will come back. And next time, she won't be using non-lethal rounds. Min-jae's obsidian eyes searched hers, searching for a way to argue, but he found only the immovable resolve of a woman who had finally found her peace. He realized that this was her ultimate act of protection. By vanishing, she was granting him a truly clean slate, untainted by the foreigner in boots who had fought his wars for him. Where will you go? He asked softly. Chicago is still there, Naya replied, her gaze drifting back to the horizon. But I think I've spent enough time in the cold. There are other cities with other monsters, and I have a resume written in the broken bones of 60 assassins. I think I'll see where the wind takes a ghost who finally knows who she is. She stepped back, her posture saying she had already won her final battle. She didn't ask for the $50 million. She didn't ask for a seat at the new table. She simply picked up her tactical pack, slung it over her shoulder, and walked toward the service elevator, the same way the assassins had entered, and the same way she would exit as a myth. Naya, Min-jae called out just as the doors began to shut. She paused, her sharp, unblinking eyes meeting his one last time. Thank you, he said, the words carrying the weight of a man whose soul had been saved. Naya didn't say a word. She simply gave a sharp, two-finger salute, the gesture of a captain who had completed her mission, and vanished into the mechanical dark. By noon, the story of the New Year's massacre had spread through the global underworld like wildfire. The Golden Triangle went silent. The agency in Langley held an emergency meeting to discuss the sudden disappearance of Silas Thorne and the Shadow, who had dismantled a tier 1 unit in 15 minutes. In the nightclubs of Seoul and the boardrooms of the Obsidian Syndicate, people spoke in hushed tones about the black woman who had stood against an army. Some said she was a government experiment, others said she was a vengeful spirit of the city itself. Park Min-jae began his first day as a legitimate leader, his empire transforming under his brilliant, steady hand. He never mentioned her name. He never confirmed the rumors. But every morning at sunrise, he would stand